Welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to see all of you here. We have a wonderful afternoon ahead of us, a summer's day. If we look outside, it's far from a summer's day, but hopefully that will change in a month or so. I'm very happy to see so many colleagues, students, friends, and also the Smilde family and the supporters of the Emmius Fonds. We have now, since 2014, the Dirk Smilde Fellowship and Scholarship, which we invite a senior colleague from around the world to spend a couple of months with us here. And we are very happy that Professor George Brooke will be with us the next 4 months. We have a seminar every week. And in that seminar, we share work with each other, but there's also a clear theme. And this year also Professor Brooke will have not only this one lecture now, but throughout the seminar, there will be a couple of more lectures. And we are looking also ahead of publishing those lectures as a book. So to have, in addition to the Dirk Smilde Fellowship, also a lecture series, as it were. I'm very happy that we have now for the 3rd time a fellowship here. We also have a scholarship. Gareth Wearne will later on also speak to you and respond to George's lecture and also share some of the work that he will be doing here while he's in Groningen. I have to apologize also on behalf of our university president. It has been quite an eventful week, and unfortunately he can't be with us here this afternoon. That does not refrain me from thanking him from all the support that he has given us throughout the years for not only the Qumran Institute, but also the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at large, and his view and vision and support also for the humanities and seeing the importance of what we do as scholars. And I'm very happy also with the fellowship that we have to show the great value of what is now termed, for lack of a better word, internationalization. It simply is not standing with your back to the world, but connecting and sharing with each other throughout the world. And for that, it is easy to use a language everyone understands. That's why we speak in English. Now, without further ado, I want to go to the next part, and that is to present George and also Gareth, if you also want to step forward, with a small booklet by which you then can remember your, hopefully, after a couple of months, great time in Groningen. And I would like first to hand out the certificate of the Dirk Smilde Fellowship 2018 to Professor Dr. George Brooke. And then it's also my great pleasure to hand out the certificate of the Dirk Smilde Scholarship 2018 to Dr. Gareth Wearne. Gareth. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to George to take us to a summer's day. After that, Gareth will give his response. And then there will also be plenty of time for questions and answers, discussions. And we round it all off with nice drinks and snacks. Enjoy. George.
I think the one thing that I hope to do by the end of 4 months is to pronounce the word Groningen correctly. I will keep trying, but I hope not to try your patience today. A summer's day, and of course there is a question mark at the end of that, as indeed also in the text from which the quotation comes. But let me start by sharing with you a little bit of my pedigree. There are 2 stories of scholars and scrolls from the very outset. There are 7 principal scrolls that were discovered in Cave 1, but they were discovered in 2 lots. And one lot ended up being purchased by Professor Eliezer Sukenik at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, here on the left of the picture. Eventually, the other set of scrolls from Cave 1 were purchased by the Syrian Orthodox bishop in Jerusalem, Mar Athanasius Samuel. And Samuel didn't know what he had, kept the material for a few weeks, and eventually sent a monk to the American School of Oriental Research in February 1948. And there were 2 young scholars. The director was away in Iraq. So the young scholars had to deal with the monk and his inquiries. Those 2 scholars were John Trevor and William Brownlee. And here you can see pictures of them. John Trevor, as a young man, engaged in February 1948, photographing the scrolls that the monk had brought to the American school. And those photographs have been very valuable indeed in helping scholars work on those texts. On the right is William Brownlee, shortly before he died. He died just after retiring, very sadly. But he was my doctoral supervisor. So, if you like, it goes Goat, Mar Samuel, William Brownlee, George Brooke. 4th in line to the cave. Brownlee was an expert on Ezekiel. That's what he'd studied for his doctoral dissertation. And in fact, he was working on Ezekiel when the monks knocked on the door of the American school. But he quickly changed to becoming interested in what he eventually came to call the Midrash Pesha of Habakkuk, one of the scrolls that these monks brought to the American school. And it was his interest in Bible interpretation in the scrolls that attracted me to go and study with him in Claremont. A little bit of a roundabout route, but I got there eventually. And I worked with him on a companion project on not Midrash Pesha straight and simple, as with Pesha Habakkuk, but with a mixed midrash, if you like, a thematic midrash, the so-called 4Q Florilegium. But since then, I've become involved in all kinds of different aspects of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. And what has become increasingly apparent to me is I really know nothing about anything. And that's for true. I'm what they call in English a jack of all trades. Right? I can say a little bit about nearly everything, but I'm not an expert. So it's a great privilege and honor to be appointed to the Smilde Fellowship, because what have I done to merit it? So I'm hoping that I can share with you some of my more general jack-of-all-trade questions about how we approach the scrolls. And I'm hoping through the next 4 months to learn within the seminar and over coffee how my thinking might be appropriate or not. So some introductory words. The Miami News of the 23rd of September 1973 reported as follows. An interesting switch was pulled in Rome yesterday by Adam Nordwell, an American Chippewa chief. As he descended his plane from California dressed in full tribal regalia, Nordwell announced in the name of the American Indian people that he was taking possession of Italy by right of discovery, in the same way that Christopher Columbus did in America. I proclaim this day the day of the discovery of Italy, said Nordwell. What right did Columbus have to discover America when it had already been inhabited for thousands of years? The same right I now have to come to Italy and proclaim the discovery of your country. So my lecture this afternoon is about analogy, comparison. Not so much about contrast, right, but about comparison. We'll come to contrast later on during my stay. Comparison and how it seems to be taking place in so many surprisingly different ways in relation to the Dead Sea Scrolls. In this 70th anniversary year of the first discoveries of scrolls in Cave 1 in the foothills above Qumran, two matters can be set out immediately. And here are some preliminary points. The first is that at least part of the fascination that the scrolls command is the result of us knowing where they come from, where they were penned, or at least some of them, perhaps, who collected them together, possibly, and their significance in changing the perspective on things that previously could only be surmised. But the second matter we're aware of is that scholars remain remarkably unclear in very many instances about how the scrolls should be understood. And in my opinion, that lack of clarity is in large measure because there has not been enough reflection on the key issue of what might form the most suitable basis for their comparative understanding, both in part and as a whole. Three further issues have clouded the scholarly approach. First, there's the issue of the relative absence of immediately suitable, that is, local and contemporary comparative material. It is indeed the case that before the scrolls were discovered, all we had in Hebrew and Aramaic from Palestine at the time of Hillel and Jesus were some coin inscriptions, some ossuary inscriptions, and a few other bits and pieces. From the 11, or is it now 12, or more caves at and near Qumran, there are now about 1,000 manuscripts, mostly very fragmentary, in all shapes and sizes, and quite remarkably, overwhelmingly containing literary compositions rather than merely being documentary debris, such as legal documents or bills of sale and receipts. Quite simply, there is nothing in Palestine from that time with which the scrolls can be compared. Even when the other textual discoveries from the Judean wilderness are considered, such as those from Wadi Dalieh, 14 kilometers north of Jericho, or those from Masada at the southwestern end of the Dead Sea, the Qumran finds remain highly distinctive as a literary collection. But in my opinion, we must question the degree and kind of distinctiveness that the collection has through appropriate comparative study. And a second point to be kept in mind is just how the dominant narratives of the period have controlled both the scholarly and the popular discourse. Those narratives include the way that Josephus constructs the historical overview of the period from the Maccabean revolt in 167 to 164 BCE until the fall of Masada in 73 or 74 CE, into which has been fitted, almost without reflection, the teacher and his movement. Josephus's construction of Jewish history remains dominant. They also include the standard Sunday school view of the more or less single-line development of normative ideological Judaism from the time of Ezra's reading of the law and the apparent end of prophecy to the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince, whose broader frame of reference is a straight line from Moses to Maimonides. And the dominant narratives also include several sets of assumptions about what might have constituted the cultural complexities of the time, often with misuse of such terms as Hellenistic, which for some serves as a geographical as well as a temporal marker, in addition to its cultural connotations. For the scrolls from the caves, such a historical narrative as that of Josephus has inhibited what might be said about the origins and diversity and significance of the movement. That of the single line of the ideological development of Judaism has led to the marginalization of all this new evidence. And that of cultural hegemony has often imposed an introversionist religious purism on people behind all the new data, which they might not really deserve. And third, there's the modern problem of the fragmentation of knowledge. In the humanities in recent decades, it's become increasingly obvious that there's an urgent need for collaboration and cooperation amongst scholars. This has often seemed to be the case in the field of Dead Sea Scrolls. But in fact, in many such collaborations, each contributor speaks from and remains in their chosen specialism or subspecialism, or for some, sub-subspecialism. Few dare to offer integrative or synthetic overviews. As such, it's intriguing to see that within one specialist subfield of Dead Sea Scrolls studies, comparative work is carried on in one way, whereas in another, the comparative work is of a rather different sort. So in this brief talk, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we will cover very briefly comparative material from hundreds of years apart, actually thousands of years apart, and from very different regions, from east and west, north and south. Why? In all this, my argument here is that there needs to be greater reflection on the character of comparativism, the methods and assumptions of comparative study. Adam Nordwell's claim to have discovered Italy is helpful in this respect. Comparative work depends upon there being some fundamental similarity. Both Nordwell and Columbus claimed a country that had already been inhabited by its own people for centuries. Thus, Nordwell insists that he has as much right to claim Italy as Columbus had to claim America. Nordwell's analogical point is that just as he really has no right to claim Italy for the American Indian people, so Columbus also had no such right. That is how good, sound analogy works. But my talk's title comes from William Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, in which the poet addresses his beloved. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines. by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. The sonnet begins with the classic question concerning what might make a suitable comparison for an adequate description of the beloved. The argument is then built through what some rabbis came to describe as an argument of Kalvahoma, an argument from the lesser to the greater. A common form of comparison is such and such is the simple, plain, or light case, then how much more is it the case that? So summer's day may be very nice, but you are just fabulous. Then the development of the poet's thinking is that the beloved is beyond compare. Not like a summer's day, or even a whole glorious summer season, but an eternal summer, unlike anything known. But finally, the sonnet makes the point that the very quest for comparison is what endorses and ensures the distinctiveness of the beloved. This, that is, the poem, gives life to thee. Are the Dead Sea Scrolls like something else? Are they beyond compare? Or should we not rather engage with the comparative quest and ask more plainly, with what and how shall we compare the Dead Sea Scrolls? And now I have a quick attempt at showing you some examples of comparison in 8 different respects. For some of you who know a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls, this will come as a little refresher course. And you can spot my mistakes. For others of you, this may be a nice little introduction to the kinds of things that we're looking at. So, my first question is a question which has been addressed in that very small little image of a book recently published in the series Studies on the Text of the Desert of Judah, which I'm very proud to edit, but which was edited for many, many years by Florentino Garcia Martinez, who's here today, and we all owe Florentino a massive debt of thanks for his work with this series, amongst many other things. Now, is the collection of manuscripts in these Qumran caves a library? Frank Cross wrote one of the most influential general surveys of the scrolls from the Qumran caves, based on his 1957 Haskell Lectures. And his book was entitled, deceptively simply, The Ancient Library of Qumran and Modern Biblical Studies. It's gone through 3 editions. Cross has retained vigorously the word library in each edition, refusing to give it up. But there is now a big question mark against whether the term is suitable. Does the term library act suitably to describe what comes from the caves? In a way, this modern etic term implies that the manuscripts together reflect some kind of collecting intention. In fact, there is indeed a remarkable coherence about what has been preserved. in the Qumran caves. For a start, it's almost entirely a literary collection. In addition, it's apparent that there are virtually no non-Jewish compositions amongst the collection, possibly none at all. And within the collection, depending on how one constructs the developing ideologies of the movement making use of the manuscripts, there's an ideological coherence of sorts, so that even compositions that could be picked up by other communities, such as eventually the Book of Jubilees and the books of Enoch were in the Eastern churches, nevertheless, those same compositions can be appreciated as on a trajectory that might lead to some form of sectarian thinking. But two things, at least, need to be said in relation to this comparison. The first is the demand commonly to be heard that the most apposite historical comparisons are those that are contemporary with the data being investigated. With what collections or libraries from the ancient world might a suitable comparison be made? Do we make conjectures, for example, about the likely contents and purposes of the temple library in Jerusalem, of which nothing apparently survives, unless you believe that the Qumran finds are themselves the remains of the temple library? Unlikely. Or do we have to go further afield and think of the archival and hieratic character of something like the library at Alexandria, in a recreation on the left of the picture here? Or is the comparison better made with the library of Pergamum, which might have contained up to 200,000 scrolls, which flourished at the turn of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, and had a female patron, actually very similar to the Rylands Library in Manchester? Or should we look to make a comparison with the library of Celsus, depicted here on the right, at Ephesus, which interestingly was a kind of mausoleum, and that might explain the Qumran cemetery in a new way? Or should we think of the private library at Herculaneum, which has about 1,800 papyrus scrolls, very similar then to the size of library at Qumran, mostly concerned with Epicurean philosophy, so ideologically coherent? Or might we consider the collection of 750 tablets from Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall, which are mostly administrative and personal documents, including an invitation to a birthday party, which I put here as an example of a kind of, if you like, documentary text, which would mark out the Vindolanda collection as somewhat distinctive from, say, what we have at Herculaneum. The second qualification to be made concerns the finds from the Qumran caves themselves. To begin with, it has to be noted that the caves are principally of two kinds: the natural caves in the cliffs some way from the Qumran site, and the man-made caves in the marl terraces at and adjacent to Qumran. Do the different types and locations of cave serve different purposes, which might undermine seeing the collection as a whole? Then, in addition, there's the character of the remains from each cave. To my mind, the finds from Cave 1, for example, probably wrapped in linen and deposited in sealed jars, are akin to later Genizot. The manuscripts appear to be buried and are unlikely to have been for regular use. On the other hand, several scholars have noted that the deposit in Cave 6 looks like the remains of a personal library. Those in Cave 7 are all in Greek and on papyrus, perhaps a special collection. And those in Cave 4 might form a working deposit for the community at the site just a stone's throw away. Or, as Geza Vermesh the Dean of British Scrolls Scholarship used to enjoy remarking, within spitting distance. That is, since the community members were explicitly prohibited from spitting. The date of the various deposits has also to be taken into account, and the likelihood that some of the manuscripts were being copied at Qumran for sale or distribution elsewhere. Libraries that sell their books are, for us academics at least, often objects of scorn. But perhaps we should conceive of Qumran as more than a library, perhaps also as a place of scroll manufacture. Qumran does not seem to be like the university library here. As I was walking through the faculty library today, it was pointed out to me that the library there has become largely redundant, consists mostly of duplicates. A wonderful analogy to the Qumran collection, it struck me, mostly duplicates. In all this, we learn that analogies require relevantly similar examples. We're at the start of a process of reassessment of the nature of the scrolls from Qumran and their various caves, and many fresh questions are being asked. Once we have some more secure answers, then there might well be the basis for the selection of relevantly similar examples of literary collections from the ancient world with which appropriate comparison can be made. Example 2, the so-called biblical texts. So-called, right, because ain't no Bible in this period. Amongst the very first finds of manuscripts from what came to be designated as Cave 1 were 2 copies of Isaiah. The best preserved came into the hands of the Syrian Orthodox bishop Mar Athanasius Samuel. The less well preserved was purchased by Eliezer Sukenik. It very quickly became apparent that both scrolls contained multiple minor variants from the standard Masoretic text of the medieval rabbinic Bibles, 2 of which you can see here, the Aleppo Codex and Leningradensis. So these are from the 9th and 10th centuries CE. They're the immediate basis of comparison, something 1,000 years later. And that's the point of the comments I want to make very briefly here. With previously known texts, comparison is swiftly made with known forms of them. For the better appreciation of the evidence from the Qumran caves, this basic comparison has had several problematic features which have only relatively recently begun to be properly addressed, and some ongoing influences, some of which are positive and others negative. Using the Masoretic text as the norm or standard for comparison with the manuscript data from Qumran has created some anachronistic anomalies, which in my opinion have also been complicated because of the issue of the authority that the later form of the text carries for the Jewish community and Western Christians. It's difficult to convince people, even some scholars, that the Masoretic text is the result of a long chain of transmission involving many accidents, rather than something that persistently carries the voice of the divine from earliest times. As a result of some early studies, the so-called Great Isaiah scroll was defined as a vulgar text. Technical term meaning a popular text, but vulgar can also have a pejorative sense. Clever term, right? Evidence you don't really need to take into account. It was labelled as a vulgar text by the first generation of textual critics and seen to be of little value for the discussion of the transmission of Isaiah. I know of only one commentary in German, Odelhannisch Steck, and 2 in English by Joseph Blenkinsop and Hugh Williamson that take the scroll seriously. The Hebrew University Bible Project and the more recent publication of a new edition of the manuscript have brought it back into the conversation in a detailed way so that it can be appreciated for what it is, rather than denigrated because of comparison with the authoritative Masoretic text. The publication of the so-called biblical manuscripts, about 200 of them, from the caves at and near Qumran and elsewhere, have enabled scholars to see with fresh eyes the vitality of Scripture in the late Second Temple period. Very significantly, this has rejuvenated the study of the Greek versions, very heavily influenced by the Minor Prophets scroll, which you can see at the top right-hand side of the picture on the screen. So the Greek versions have come to the fore in much biblical study. But also the Samaritan textual tradition has taken on a new life, not least because of 4Q Paleo Exodus M, which is in the bottom, a fragment of which is in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So perhaps it is those versions that are the more significant and relevant comparators than the Masoretic text. In fact, it was enjoyable to hear Emmanuel Tove, the former principal editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls, say in a recent lecture that there were no Masoretic manuscripts amongst the finds from Qumran. And it's not that this textual variety existed discreetly in different places, because it's all present in just one place. Nor is it possible to determine whether at any one time in the period before the fall of the temple in 70, there was only ever one official text of Scripture in play. For me, this all shows that scribes were active participants in the transmission process of scriptural and other texts. And if anything is to be said to faith communities today about Scripture, it has to do with how the faithful need to take a similarly active role in being responsible for the suitable transmission and interpretation of their texts and traditions. Thus, the so-called biblical manuscripts have been analysed through comparison with other forms of the text of the biblical books, and in many ways this has had a distorting effect, both on the way the material from the Qumran caves is described. The Bible manuscripts in each cave are always listed first in principal editions. That's a con job. Right? Why should that be the case? And they're also listed in the order of the later canon. Heaven knows why that's the case. But all of this can be discussed. What about the Qumran site? What do we compare that with? Well, it was Eliezer Sukenik who first promoted the idea that those responsible for the Hodayot, the hymn scroll, and the rule of the community were none other than the Essenes of the classical sources, especially those of Philo, Josephus, and Pliny the Elder. And it was the evidence of Pliny, though frequently contested, that has not only placed the Essenes at the Qumran site, beneath which is Ein Gedi, but which has also been responsible for depicting the occupants as celibate ascetics. Claude Conder was amongst those in the 19th century who paraphrased Pliny's description. I quote, "From a very early period, this horrible wilderness appears to have had an attraction for ascetics, who sought a retreat from the busy world of their fellow men, and who sought to please God by torturing their bodies he had given them. Thus the Essenes, the Jewish sect whose habits and tenets resembled so closely those of the first Christians, retired into this wilderness and lived in caves." Claude Conder was a British Army officer, a Royal Engineer, who spent all his leave in the Holy Land, following up ancient descriptions of things. But 25 years earlier, Félicien de Saulcy, on his expedition to circumnavigate the Dead Sea, associated the Essenes with the monks of Mar Saba, the picture here on the right-hand side of the screen, a few kilometres from the Qumran site. And a standard pre-1947 view was that the Essenes were the finest example in Judaism that could explain the development of Cenobitic monasticism in Christianity, especially in wilderness or desert settings. Assumptions about the inhabitants of Qumran, based on the descriptions of celibate ascetics described in the writings of Philo, Josephus, Pliny, have often been challenged or given refined nuance. But the analogical influence of Christian monastic terminology and the desire to recognize key correlations and not to multiply entities has created a strong view, not just that the occupants of Qumran were Essenes of some sort, but that the site, with its distinctiveness, must have had some major role in the life of the movement of which the Qumran group was a part. The archaeologists, in particular, have taken a different approach. They have rather been in search of explanatory descriptions of the site which provide key correlations with other sites and reduce the stress on the site's apparent monastic distinctiveness. Thus, similar forms of burial have been identified in Jerusalem and Transjordan. Similar pottery types and profiles are identified at Jericho. Similar concern for ritual purity is identified in private dwellings in Jerusalem, and so on. Nevertheless, it remains the case that overall there's much that is distinctive of the Qumran site and for which suitable comparison is urgently needed. Example 4, the so-called rule scrolls or surachim. 3 matters of comparison stand out here in a quick summary form. The first can be mentioned very briefly indeed, and that is that Miller Burroughs, John Trevor, and William Bramley, as they began to work on the texts from the photographs that Trevor had taken, Miller Burroughs decided that what we know in the shorthand as 1QS should be called the Manual of Discipline, comparing it generically with the kinds of church rules and regulations to be found in some modern Protestant denominations. So the Essenes are turned into modern Protestants very quickly, if that's how you label their key rule book, if it is the key rule book. Of course, such labelling raises multiple questions about the assignation of generic labels at all. And this terminology of manual of discipline is now very rarely used. We talk rather about the rule of the community, the Serek HaYachad, which really contains a double set of neologisms, which gives us a real problem. But as the proverb goes, give a dog a bad name and it sticks. The comparison was widely acknowledged to be inapt. But a second point is more important. In terms of contemporary models, it has long been proposed, especially by Moshe Weinfeld, Matthias Klinghardt and Yonda Gillian, that the voluntary associations of the Hellenistic world could provide some comparative heuristic parallel for what is present in the so-called sectarian texts. The parallels are not precise, partly because in many instances the language of scriptural traditions, often adapted for new purposes, plays a significant part in the scrolls, over against the technical terminology found in some of the literature associated with the classical voluntary associations. There's no straightforward adoption by the Qumran group, or the movement of which it was a part, of a foreign model of association, of a philosophical school, say, or a civic guild. Nevertheless, Josephus's comparative association of the Essenes with the Pythagoreans is indicative that even in antiquity, such comparison could bear weight. But in the final analysis, the Cave 1 version of the rule of the community remains distinctive, both in the way it begins, not with prescriptions for membership, but with a liturgy associated with the initiation of new members, perhaps a liturgy in a summary form. And also in the way that it concludes, not with a celebration of retirement from communal office, but with a poetic reminder of human insignificance. This is a phenomenological comparison and needs to be cleared at the first hurdle. A significant degree of basic similarity is being searched for here. Are we on the right track? But third, in relation to the Sirachim, a significant attempt at understanding the contents of the rule of the community and the Yachad group that it seems to describe has been based on a resort to comparative modelling of a different sort. And I refer to the use of the social sciences to describe the sect that seems to be responsible for the rule and also for other constitutional compositions. The application of those models is not applied in any detail to the archaeological evidence, apart from some brief mentions in some instances of withdrawal into the wilderness. Most commonly applied have been the types of sect as developed over the years, especially by Brian Wilson, with the Qumran group coming out most often in the category of introversionist, with some reformist tendencies perhaps. Such categories are based principally on the study of modern Christian sects and questions about their transferability to ancient groups in other religious traditions raises doubts about the comparative value of the stereotypes. Such categories are engaging the more they are related to the textual and other data provided in the ancient sources, as is reflected in the recent work of Jutta Jokiranta from Helsinki. They are less engaging when taken as representative of more widespread, even universal types of human behaviour, such as is a feature of the study of Ayel Regev and his comparison of groups such as the Amish with those reflected in the scrolls from Qumran. And I'm hoping to develop this in subsequent seminar presentations here, because this is where we begin to touch on the significance of how comparative studies in the modern humanities has emerged out of social anthropology in particular. There's a surprise, Barry. The Pesharim. And here's an interesting development that's taken place recently. The Pesharim are the more formally constituted running Bible commentaries found in the Qumran caves, especially Cave 1 and Cave 4. In 2012, the specialist journal Dead Sea Discoveries produced a thematic issue devoted to the rise of commentary. It contained expert articles on ancient Near Eastern, Greek, Roman, and Jewish commentary texts. In an introductory essay, I tried to reflect on the comparative exercise that the reader was being asked to undertake, making observations on the advantages and disadvantages of diachronicity and synchronicity, and taking advantage of the various expert essays to compile a set of issues that might assist in the better understanding of the Pesharim from the Qumran caves. In a previous generation, the dominant comparison has been to notice that the identification of various features of the scriptural base text with particular items in the experience of the commentator's community, even if those are voiced in a stereotypical way, has been to associate them with the kind of dream fulfillment that's described in the book of Daniel, using a similar Aramaic term, pathar. And this has then been derived from ancient Near Eastern dream or omen interpretation. But now along comes Reinhard Kratz, but actually in particular detail Barry Hartog, who are beginning to argue for us that the best comparative data are to be found in the Greek hypomnemata, the early Greek commentaries, the scholia texts, which comment on the works of Homer, and which are preserved, at least some of them are, amongst the Oxyrhynchus remains. So go and buy this man's book and learn a completely fresh comparative agenda for understanding the Qumran Pesharim. The calendrical texts. Well, I must be the first to admit that I'm not an expert in this area, but I've had a doctoral student, and I hope she's watching the live stream, hi Helen, who has worked on them and who's tried to educate me in some aspects of their significance. And she's worked on this text, 4Q318. Now, the first detailed study that I read on 4Q318 was by Michael Wise, published in 1994. And he, in his presentation of the text, noted in particular, and you can only just see this in the small chart on the bottom left hand of the slide, that day one happens to begin in Taurus for this schematic presentation of the calendar. And he argued that this must be evidence that the text is echoing some kind of world history, what is technically known as a thema mundi, because of the understanding of the precession of the zodiac. It takes about 2,000 years for us to work through a sign of the zodiac. We're just entering the age of Aquarius, right? But if you read your Bible text carefully, you can work out roughly that creation took place 4,000 years ago. So you work back through your signs of the zodiac, and that means that creation must have taken place with day one in Taurus. I thought this was a great interpretation because the precession of the zodiac was attributed to Hipparchus, a Greek philosopher and astronomer who lived in Asia Minor in the 2nd century BCE. And Wise was pointing to the idea that knowledge from Asia Minor was making it to Palestine, into this community, maybe 100 years later. However, subsequent work on 318 by various scholars in Germany and Israel preferred rather to juxtapose the text with a Babylonian system of calculations as known in the Mul Apin, probably from the first half of the first millennium BCE. And this is the view which is adopted in the official presentation of this text in the Discoveries in the Judean series. The new proposal of my student Helen is that in Babylonian tradition there was an effective distinction between astronomical and astrological traditions, the former always being updated with the latest observations, the latter, astrology, being highly schematic and largely stable. So for her, the calendrical section of 318 reflects in a simplified manner knowledge of the Babylonian schematic dodecatemoria, 360-degree presentations of the horoscope traditions. It has some accurate astronomical data and was possibly calibrated, as it is, for the year after an intercalation has taken place. But the overall purpose is to provide a stable frame of reference for horoscope analysis. Through her comparative work, based on the precise analysis of the astronomical astrological science reflected in the scroll as she understands it, she has also proposed that the text should be named consistently and more precisely as a zodiac calendar and brontologion, accounting principally for its constituent parts. Here we are in a real minefield. What do we do when we compare the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament? There are kind of three options. I'll mention them very briefly. One is to say that the scrolls in the New Testament basically have nothing to say to each other. Interestingly, one aspect of this approach has been adopted by the famous scholar who recently died, Joseph Fitzmyer, who, when it came to the figure of Jesus, argued strongly that nothing in the Jesus tradition could be really illuminated from the Qumran scrolls. He wanted to protect the uniqueness, the distinctiveness of Jesus. I think this view has largely fallen out of fashion. A second approach, which we can see here on the slide, is to say that actually the two phenomena are the same thing. And if you wanted to know what the teacher of righteousness looked like, here's a picture of him. He is James the Just, figured in the Acts of the Apostles, as represented here on an icon. And this is the view of the likes of Robert Eisenman. It's in a very different form, the view of Barbara Thiering from Australia. These are scholars who are trying to impose the New Testament data on the scrolls, or the other way around, and say that A equals A, or A equals B. Interestingly, there are still some very learned supporters of this kind of approach. Etienne Naudet of the École Biblique has recently published a book supporting some aspects of Eisenman's approach. But a third approach, which I've long supported myself, has been to try to be even-handed in noticing similarities and differences, and looking to make some assertions about a zeitgeist in Palestine, what was in the air, which people would have been able to pick up, whether those things were messianic and eschatological or had to do with the interpretation of scriptural texts, whatever. But working out the mechanics of the comparison really matters in this respect. And my last example is the Copper Scroll. What on earth should we compare this with? This is a highly distinctive scroll. It was found by the archaeologists, so it's not a plant from the Middle Ages or anything like that, towards the back of Cave 3, with Qumranic-style jars and scrolls in front, discovered by Henri de Contesson, and brilliantly opened in Manchester by being sawn into strips, as you can see here, by Professor Wright Baker at the Institute of Science and Technology, the College of Science and Technology in Manchester, using bits and pieces from his cupboard, which he'd been the assistant to Barnes Wallis, who worked for the Ministry of Defence in the war and designed the bouncing bomb, which was meant to destroy German dams. So they had all kinds of drills and railway tracks and all sorts of things in their cupboard as they worked to put something together to saw the Copper Scroll open. Now, this document is highly distinctive. What do we do with it? The principal editor, Joseph Millick, decided that the quantities of precious metal were so great that they could not be taken seriously. As a result, he was inclined to see the document as a fantasy, with its chief comparator being the Egyptian Arabic text, the Book of Buried Pearls and Hidden Treasure, which Ahmed Bey Kamil published in Cairo in 1907, a copy of which happened to be in the library of the École Biblique in Jerusalem. I've never seen a copy of this book in the UK, but the librarian at the École Biblique offered this to Millick as the best way of understanding the Copper Scroll, and he proceeded to work with this text. Most people now have argued rather that the treasure in the scroll is real, that the quantities have to be rethought and recalculated, and yet we are still in search of a suitable basis of comparison for trying to understand why someone should write a list of buried treasure on 3 sheets of copper which have survived in 2 rolls and which are now in Amman in Jordan. There have been some suggestions, and these tend to make the television sets that some people watch. For example, a certain Robert Feather, who is a metallurgist, has argued that the Greek letters in the scroll, which occur in 7 places in the copper scroll, make up the name Akhenaten, and that the treasure is actually the treasure of Pharaoh Akhenaten from the site of Amarna, and that this then explains what's going on. The text is a preservation of traditions by Jews of this first monotheist who had this wonderful hoard of treasure. How should this composition be read? With what and how should it be compared? As with the beloved in Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, some aspects of the scrolls are understood better through comparison, while other matters in the end seem to have a notable distinctiveness which needs to be acknowledged. Shall I compare the Dead Sea Scrolls with a summer evening in Groningen? Possibly. Here we are. But let's have a few concluding points. I hope this talk in this place already indicates just how significant the scrolls are. Thinking about comparison gives them life and indicates how very culturally complex they actually are. Not what might be expected, such cultural complexity, in a marginal, disempowered minority group stuck out in the wilderness, if we believe some people's description of who put the collection together. If only scholars might see the overall significance of all the comparative work they've done, then the scrolls will quickly re-emerge as of importance to the better understanding of what is taking place much more broadly at all levels of society and culture in the Palestine of Hillel and Jesus, and even beyond. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, George. Before we open the floor for questions and answers, I want to invite Gareth for a first response.
Before I respond, I'd like to just quickly say that it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to once again thank Professor Popovich and the members of the Dirk Smilde Committee and also the Emmaus Fund for awarding me the Dirk Smilde Scholarship. And also to the Faculty for Theology and Religious Studies here in Groningen and the Qumran Institute for their generosity and hospitality during my stay. Professor Brooke's lecture addressed 2 important questions for the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. First, what roles have comparative methods played in the study of writing, of the writings from the Judean desert and related topics? And second, what methodological controls can we develop to ensure justifiable comparative work in the future? The question of comparative method is an intrinsically important one in the humanities, as it's through analogy that we're able to contextualize our research and recognize its significance. Analogy enables us to orient ourselves in relation to the object of our study by evaluating what is similar or distinctive about a particular worldview or sociological experience, and thereby better understand our own thought processes and assumptions. Comparative methods are also the basis of much of the inductive work of historical inquiry, as we attempt to come to terms with new or uncertain evidence and to work from what is known to what is unknown. In large part, it's this careful attention to such methodological questions that makes the scholarship conducted here in Groningen of such international significance. In the next few minutes, I'd like to address my remarks to two aspects of Professor Brooke's lecture. The first relates to the nature of comparative research, and the second relates to its method. My first point relates to the relative significance of both similarity and differences in the way they're treated in the comparative method. And I note that later in the seminar series we'll be focusing more on the question of difference, so I hope I don't get too far ahead of myself here. As each of the examples that we've just heard illustrates, differences can often be just as illuminating as similarities. In fact, part of the value of the comparative method is that it casts shadows as well as light, helping us to identify previously unrecognized gaps in our knowledge or understanding. Ultimately, the bard's comparison with the summer day falls short in its capacity to describe the beloved, but in doing so, it opens up new descriptive possibilities regarding the beloved's incomparability. We could scarcely have a better guide in this aspect of comparative studies, since even-handed attention to both similarity and distinctiveness is one of the hallmarks of Professor Brooke's own scholarship. The binary nature of analogy also means that there's an important metacritical dimension to comparative research, which can reveal much about our own attitudes and practices. As Professor Brooke observed, comparative work depends upon there being some fundamental similarity between the objects under comparison. That includes similarity of scale as well as similarity of kind. Part of the rhetorical force of Adam Nordwell's land claim lies in the question of scale. That is not to say that there's a qualitative difference between the colonising claims of Nordwell and Columbus, but there is nonetheless an element of irony in Nordwell's claim which depends on the perceived difference that exists in the mind of the audience. That is to say, the rhetorical force of the comparison rests, at least in part, on the fact that it draws attention to uncomfortable truths about Western stereotypes concerning civilization and cultural worth. We've seen something similar in attempts to classify or characterize the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus as a library, or the way in the 20th century models of the community seem to have been influenced by experiences of Western Christianity or the academy. Acknowledging the distinctiveness of the scrolls in these areas can open up new lines of inquiry, but it can also draw our attention to anachronistic assumptions or prejudices which might otherwise go unnoticed. In other words, even poor or imperfect analogies can serve a valuable role in helping us to better understand our own socio-cultural context and the intellectual tradition in which we stand. To put it another way, comparative methods are like a mirror, reflecting back the questions we ask and the relative significance we attach to them. This is important because it means that comparative studies can reveal as much about us as the objects of our study, sometimes more. My second point relates to the method of comparative research. More specifically, I'd like to return to the question, how can we establish effective controls for comparative work? I'd like to draw you out further on this point, if I may, Professor Brooke, and ask you to offer an opinion about how we might begin to accomplish this as a community of scholars. Are there general criteria you could point to which would qualify something as a justifiable analogy? Or must we treat every comparison individually, owing to the highly specialised nature of comparative work? It seems to me that the issue is complicated by the diversity which already exists in the vast body of scholarly literature that has been generated over the course of 70 years of Dead Sea Scrolls study, and also by the fact that new comparanda and new methods of comparison continue to present themselves. In general terms, it seems reasonable that all potential comparanda should be given equal opportunity to be brought into dialogue with the scrolls, regardless of temporal or geographical distance. But that is not to say that all analogies are equal, and I agree that we must develop the habit of asking how and why an analogy works, not just whether it works. To take just one example of the open-ended nature of comparison, in recent years, the humanities have experienced something of a cognitive turn. This has been characterised by a return to big questions about the degree to which human nature and experiences can be understood as universal, and whether we can ever truly understand the experiences and motivations of others. In historical linguistic and literary studies, it has been marked by a particular focus on emotions and the role of memory and cognition in mediating the way people construe and interact with the world around them. This poses a challenge insofar as we are unable to ask someone from the past about their perceptions or experiences. We can only access these through the textual artefacts they have left behind. The most effective way of doing this is through comparison with modern sources, but this has the consequences of introducing a new set of comparative material and an expanded frame of reference. Such questions have begun to make their way into Dead Sea Scrolls studies, especially via the related field of textual criticism. My own research focuses on the cognitive processes involved in the copying of texts, similar to what David Carr has called memory variants in his studies of the transmission and formation of the Hebrew Bible. And it seeks to develop empirical controls for the identification and classification of copying errors by focusing on correction practices in the scrolls. In this case, the purpose of the comparative study is partly to establish a benchmark and to test the suitability of the scrolls as a comparandum for copying in less well-documented contexts. Such research has potentially significant impacts for the way we think about the copying of early biblical manuscripts, but it also promises to open up new avenues for thinking about the effective power of the literary tradition and the perception of textual authority in the processes of canonization. Yet, as I just mentioned, it also poses a problem insofar as it introduces yet another corpus of comparative material in the form of a modern dataset, and a challenge in terms of how it should be integrated with existing scholarship. And this, I think, highlights one of the challenges with developing an integrated approach to comparative studies. That is, comparisons are multifaceted and open-ended by nature. What's more, the modification or introduction of a concept in one area tends to require adjustments throughout the system. Clearly, these are questions to which I must continue to give serious thought, but any advice you could give to a young scholar would be greatly received. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And George, but also Gareth, if there are questions for you, I would like to give the floor to the audience. I have not watched the time, by the way. Oh, it's 5 o'clock, so we have a little bit of time for questions and answers. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have 2 microphones. We ask you to wait before you ask your question when you have a microphone, because then also the audience via the live stream can hear your question. Who may I give the floor to? George.
Well, George, thank you so much. Very interesting paper. You can I very much like your comparative approach. What would you say to people who, like Sandmo, who criticize parallelomania? Is your answer mainly drawn from kind of social anthropology? Could you give some hint what you're going to explore over the next months?
Yeah, thank you for that question, which also gives me a chance to say thank you to Gareth for his comments, and to suggest that actually Sandmel's approach, which has been taken up in various ways, in fact, in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship itself, and Gareth's approach, represent for me a kind of Anglophone pragmatism in how you go about doing comparative work. So in the next seminar in 2 weeks' time, I'm hoping to begin to offer a categorization of different comparative and contrastive approaches, basically trying to suggest that largely in the French school, so our Francophone approach, is the development of insights from anthropology, Levi-Strauss in particular, where the issue of universals suddenly becomes very problematic but dominant. And the discussion is all about whether, in fact, we can reduce things to universals at the end of the day. Over against that, the Germanic approach tends to be much more interested, not in anthropology, but in history. And so we have an approach to comparative studies which emerges in North America, where German influence remains dominant in some university faculties, which produces an understanding, not least of religion, which is stematic. It's a kind of family tree approach to how you go about doing comparison. So it's the genetic makeup of something which allows you to make justifiable comparisons. This interest in history is amongst German Dead Sea Scrolls scholars and amongst actually popular literature on the Dead Sea Scrolls in German is really fascinating to watch. But then along come the English, who take this more pragmatic approach. That is, if it works, let's use it. And you can make the comparison and see whether or not it offers something valuable. And it may be that by the time we get to the end of the series of seminars, I've convinced everybody to remain Anglophone and not to adopt either an anthropological or a narrowly historicized, I think, perhaps a way of approaching things. But there could be, we need to pay attention to all that's going on, to see what there is out there and try to learn from the different types of comparative exercise which are actually out there in the academic world, especially obviously in the humanities and social sciences, and try and capitalize on that for the Dead Sea Scrolls, because as my point at the beginning was, in relation to the ancient world, we actually know where this stuff comes from. So we've got some kind of core basis for making a comparison, and that's really important. It's really exciting, actually. So it's not that we're dealing with, medieval copies of Aristotle or something. We've actually got the ancient stuff.
Steve has a question over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brooke, for a very rich lecture. In the coming weeks, I'm sure we'll have a chance to explore many parts of it together. But a question that occurred to me that I think others might be asking, a simple clarification, if you would. On the one hand, you rejected flatly the idea of a Bible. So you said, so-called Bible, there's no Bible in the first century. On the other hand, you put great emphasis on the vitality of Scripture and talked about the origins of scriptural interpretation and even extended it to modern times and talked about faith communities, if I heard you right, thinking in the same way about revitalizing Scripture. So many people might think that Scripture and Bible are more or less the same, scriptural interpretation, biblical interpretation. Could you simply clarify why you insist there's no Bible, but you speak so readily of the vitality of Scripture? What's the difference for you? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I think you know what I'm going to say by way of answer. But that is, I'm using Bible in the very limited and restricted way of a particular set of books organized in a canonical way as normative in a particular text form. Not always, but commonly in a particular text form. Whereas I'm using Scripture of how various texts are broadly or less broadly authoritative amongst various communities. So my interest in what's going on in Second Temple period Palestinian Judaism has to do with what the scrolls show us about the transmission of these authoritative texts, which have not yet become fixed canon in a narrow or controlling sense. So it's, if you like, trying to get the appropriate comparator for understanding that it's okay to change texts. And that's a very scary thing for someone who depends upon the Word of God as unchangeable. But one wonders sometimes whether doctrines of unchangeability have emerged because changeability was normative and scary to some who wanted to exercise control over others.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering what you think about comparison with schools that has been done, and especially if you have a group of texts that are very similar in style, content. Yeah, do you think we can use school as a comparison, and what would that look like? Like, obviously we're not talking about a school as in what we send our children off to, but some kind of school.
Yeah, I think this would be a wonderful ERC project. So once Groningen's done with paleography and other things, you can get on to the next one. The thing that always comes to my mind is how illuminating Professor Loveday Alexander's book is on the preface to Luke's Gospel, where she sets the preface and its terminology as in a very technical way alongside Greek medical schools. And suddenly the text takes on a different hue, a different colour as you engage with the text. So I think there's a lot to be understood here that could be of great value. We've just published a Festschrift in honour of Philip Alexander, in fact Loveday's husband, and in that I've written a little piece on was Qumran a school, amongst other things. It's one of the subheadings. I'm inclined to think that at least the question is worth asking and addressing in a significant way, and that the most obvious place to go are the Greek schools for trying to understand this. But some people would want to juxtapose with the Greek schools, or maybe see as part of a cultural context of Greek schools the much richer understanding that we now have of the developing wisdom traditions and their reflection of Hellenistic school traditions in the late Second Temple period. So there's lots of work that can be done on this in a very profitable way.
Yeah, it's language I think I quite like.
Very.
Hello. That was close.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the relationship between the examples you gave, in the sense that the direction or the comparisons you make for one example would probably influence how you look at the other examples as well. So would you say some examples are more, or should be more central to the agenda of Qumran scholarship as it is, or how do you see the connection between them?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think all I'm doing in this talk so far is saying to people, look at what has been done in some examples and see that in some instances we're looking at Omen interpretations from the second millennium in Babylon, and at other times we're saying the chief comparative text is a medieval Bible manuscript. So we've got 3,000 years worth of material to put into the comparison. Now, if you're the French universalist anthropologist, no problem, right? You can put all that stuff in the pot and let it settle and illuminate. If you're the German with your stematic approach, you're uncomfortable with such breadth, and you're looking for something a bit tighter. Possibly your own work is a very good illustration of that, looking for something a little bit closer, and then finding actually that there is something closer that does work. Or we could say, well, let's just let all this variety stand and see what works and what helps, given that we have only fragmentary knowledge of the ancient world in any case. And we just have to make do with what we've got. So at the moment, all I'm doing is trying to say, look at all this variety that's there in terms of comparative exercises, no one's noticed this variety really, or articulated this variety explicitly. Perhaps it's time to do that, and simply in articulating the variety, we can begin to work out what might be slightly more rather than slightly less appropriate.
One final question.
Matthias Brütsch from Zurich, Switzerland. One thing we can be sure, we are comparing texts in our whole discipline. And what I learned from your British humor in the conclusion is that comparisons of texts are convincing if the compared texts are close in place and time. And one question in our discipline is 20 years old. Take the book of Kohelet. It is compared with Mesopotamian texts, Sumerian, Ugaritic, Egyptian. Should we learn from your conclusions that they rather should be compared to early Tzadokite or early Hasidim texts or the Tobiat tradition, which are close in time and place?
The simple one-word answer is yes. But again, it might be a question of how you want to delineate what it is you're actually comparing. So, as text, it may be particular idioms or phrases or subgenres or genres of material. And it could well be that we do indeed find some very similar things quite a long way away. But if we can find them more closely, one might suppose that it's those which then have had some kind of influence. And that raises the question of at what point does comparative study allow us to say literary dependence? And that's the thematic issue. So you are German Swiss. Yes, I am. So there you go.
I was going to close off and invite you for drinks, but I give the final question to Florentino. So.
Thank you very much, George, for this wonderful lecture. It's not really a question which I want to put, but the satisfaction that you are going to do this work in the cadre of the Qumran Institute. I recall very well when Adam van der Bouwde, the founder of the Institute, told me not one but several times that the reason why he started the Journal for the Study of Judaism was after being in Paris with the Pont Sommer and making sort of agreement with Carmignac in order to be able to put together a comparison of water that was using to be in the Revue de Qumran, putting at least the Persian, Hellenistic, and Yomar period, everything that was having to do with Judaism. So I am very pleased that you are going to do the work in the footsteps of Adam van der Bouwde and the Qumran Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florentino and all the others who asked questions, made statements. I want to invite all of you for drinks and snacks, but before we go there, I want to thank again George and also Gareth. Thank you very, very much.